Commander Alexander Field stood at his office window, watching the morning drill practice in the courtyard below. The Royal Guards moved with precision that had taken decades to perfect, their red uniforms crisp against the gray London sky. To any observer, it looked like routine training. But Alexander knew better. Beneath the surface of military discipline, tension was building that threatened to tear apart the most prestigious regiment in the British Army. The problems had started 6 months ago, when Alexander had been promoted to commander of the Royal Guard Regiment. At 42, he was the youngest person ever to hold the position, a fact that hadn't gone unnoticed by the older officers who felt they deserved the role. His unconventional approach to leadership had immediately clashed with centuries of tradition, creating divisions that grew deeper each day. Alexander believed the Royal Guard needed modernization. The world had changed, threats had evolved, and he argued that ceremonial traditions shouldn't prevent them from adapting to contemporary security challenges. His critics, led by Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Webb, insisted that changing anything about the Royal Guard would destroy its very essence. The latest controversy involved Alexander's proposal to integrate female guards into ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace. For over 350 years, the iconic guards in red tunics and bearskin hats had been exclusively male. Alexander saw this as an outdated restriction that wasted talent and ignored qualified female soldiers. Webb and his supporters viewed it as an assault on sacred tradition, sir. Sergeant Major Patricia Collins knocked on Alexander's door, holding a stack of incident reports. Patricia was one of Alexander's strongest allies, a career soldier who had fought for recognition in a military for 20 years. Her support for his reforms came from personal experience with the barriers that tradition could create. "Come in, Sergeant Major. What's the damage today?" Patricia set the reports on his desk with a heavy sigh. 3 more requests for transfer? Out of the regiment. 2 complaints filed with the ministry about radical changes to established protocol and Lieutenant Colonel. Webb has scheduled another meeting with the senior officers to discuss preserving regimental integrity. Alexander picked up the transfer requests, recognizing the names. Good soldiers, experienced guards who had served with distinction for years. Now they were asking to leave rather than serve under his command. Each departure felt like a personal failure, proof that his attempts at progress were creating more problems than solutions. "Any word from the palace?" Alexander asked. "The Queen's private secretary wants to see you this afternoon. No details, but given the timing, ... Patricia didn't need to finish. The mounting controversy within the Royal Guard had clearly reached the attention of the royal household. Alexander nodded grimly. He had known this moment would come. His reforms had created such internal conflict that the palace could no longer ignore the situation. The question was whether they would support his vision for a modernized Royal Guard or side with those who insisted that tradition was more important than progress. The irony wasn't lost on him. Alexander had joined the military specifically to serve the crown, driven by a deep respect for the institution and its values. His father had been a Royal Guard before him, and his grandfather before that. The Fields family had served 3 generations of monarchs with unwavering loyalty. Yet now, Alexander's interpretation of that service was being questioned by the very institution he had dedicated his life to protecting. The phone on his desk rang, interrupting his thoughts. "Commander." "Fields," he answered. "Sir, this is Captain Morrison from the duty desk. We have a situation developing in the main courtyard." Alexander looked out his window to see guards gathering in unusual formations, their normal training routine abandoned. "What kind of situation? Some of the senior guards are refusing to participate in the new integrated training exercises you ordered. They're saying they won't train alongside female soldiers for ceremonial duties." Alexander's jaw tightened. The rebellion he had feared was finally beginning. "I'll be right down." As Alexander made his way to the courtyard, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. His military career had been built on adapting to new challenges, learning from mistakes, and constantly improving. He had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, where the ability to change tactics and embrace new ideas often meant the difference between life and death. But the Royal Guard was different. Here, Traditions dating back centuries were considered sacred. The way they marched, the angle of their hats, the precise timing of ceremonial movements, all of it had been preserved exactly as it was when the regiment was first formed. Alexander understood the importance of tradition, but he also believed that institutions could honor their past while still evolving for the future. The courtyard was buzzing with tension when Alexander arrived. About 30 guards stood in formation on one side, while another group of roughly 20 remained at attention near the barracks. The divide was clear: those willing to embrace change on one side, those determined to resist it on the other. Lieutenant Colonel Webb stood with the resistors, his silver hair and weathered face making him look like the embodiment of military tradition. At 61, Webb had spent his entire adult life in service to the crown, and he saw Alexander's reforms as a betrayal of everything he had sworn to protect. "Commander Fields," Webb said formally as Alexander approached, "my men have concerns about the new training requirements." "Your men?" Alexander replied, emphasizing the possessive pronoun. "These are all soldiers in the Royal Guard Regiment, Colonel Webb. They serve under my command." "They serve the crown, sir, as do we all. And some of us believe that service requires preserving the traditions that make this regiment special." The confrontation that followed would be remembered as the moment when the Royal Guard's internal conflict exploded into open rebellion. Guards, who had served together for years, found themselves on opposite sides of a philosophical divide that threatened to destroy the unity their regiment had maintained for centuries. Alexander faced a choice that would define his legacy as a commander. He could back down, abandoning his reform efforts to preserve peace within the regiment, or he could push forward, risking a complete breakdown in discipline and potentially destroying the very institution he was trying to improve. As the two groups of guards stared at each other across the courtyard, Alexander realized that his next decision would determine whether he would be remembered as a heroic leader who modernized an ancient institution, or as the commander whose ambitions had torn the Royal Guard apart. The chaos that was about to unfold would test everyone's loyalty, challenge their understanding of duty, and force them to choose between the comfort of tradition and the uncertainty of change. And at the center of it all stood Commander Alexander Fields, about to discover whether his vision for the future was worth the price it was demanding from the past. The standoff in the courtyard lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Alexander could feel the weight of every guard's stare, the tension so thick it seemed to press against his chest. This was the moment that would define his command and possibly his entire career. "Guards, return to your quarters," Alexander ordered, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard. "Lieutenant Colonel Webb, my office." Now, the guards began to disperse slowly, reluctantly, like actors leaving a stage where the play wasn't quite finished. Alexander noticed how they moved, some with relief that the confrontation was over, others with disappointment that it hadn't escalated further. The divide within his regiment was deeper than he had imagined. In his office, Webb stood at attention, his posture perfect despite his obvious anger. Alexander had known Harrison Webb for 8 years, had respected him as a mentor when he was younger. Now they faced each other as adversaries, separated by a gulf of philosophy that seemed impossible to bridge. "Sit down, Harrison," Alexander said, using Webb's first name deliberately. "We need to talk as soldiers, not as ranks." "Ah!" Webb remained standing. "With respect, Commander, I believe we've moved beyond informal conversation." "What happened in that?" "Courtyard was a direct result of your reforms dividing this regiment. My reforms are designed to strengthen the regiment, not divide it, by destroying everything that makes us special." Webb's composure cracked slightly. "The Royal Guard isn't just another military unit, Alexander. We are the living embodiment of British tradition. Every ceremony we perform, every moment we stand. Guard, we're connecting the present to centuries of history." Alexander moved to his desk, picking up a folder thick with documents. "This is the after-action report from last month's state visit. 3 separate security agencies identified weaknesses in our protocols. Our equipment is outdated. Our training focuses on pageantry instead of protection. Our recruitment policies are eliminating half the qualified candidates in the country. Security is handled by the Specialist Protection Units, Webb countered. Our role is ceremonial, symbolic. We represent continuity, stability, the unchanging nature of the crown in a chaotic world. And what happens when that symbolic role becomes meaningless because we've failed to adapt to reality? Alexander shot back. When people look at us and see museum pieces instead of professional soldiers. Webb's expression hardened. Is that what you think we are? Museum pieces? The question hung in the air between them. Alexander realized he had touched the core of Webb's anger, the fear that modernization meant invalidating a lifetime of dedicated service. No, Harrison. I think you're one of the finest soldiers I've ever known.
Oh.
But I also think we can honor our traditions while still evolving to meet contemporary challenges. Before Webb could respond, Sergeant Major Collins knocked and entered. Sir, the palace has moved up your meeting. Sir Geoffrey Morrison wants to see you immediately. Alexander felt his stomach drop. The Queen's private secretary requesting an immediate meeting could only mean one thing. The internal conflict within the Royal Guard had reached the highest levels of concern. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Alexander said. Collins nodded and left, but not before giving Webb a look that could have frozen water. This conversation isn't over, Webb said, as he prepared to leave. No, it isn't, Alexander agreed. But Harrison, consider this. If the palace decides my reforms are too disruptive, they'll find a new commander, someone who might make changes. You'll like even less than mine. After Webb left, Alexander sat alone in his office, staring at the regimental photograph on his wall. Rows of guards in perfect formation, their faces serious and proud. How many of those men were now questioning whether they wanted to remain under his command? How many were filing transfer requests or complaints to the ministry? The drive to Buckingham Palace gave Alexander time to prepare his arguments, but also to doubt his decisions. Had he pushed too hard, too fast? Was there a way to modernize the Royal Guard without tearing it apart? Or was Webb right? Were some traditions so fundamental that changing them meant destroying the institution itself? Sir Geoffrey Morrison's office was a study in understated power. Portraits of past monarchs lined the walls, and the desk that dominated the room had witnessed decades of sensitive conversations about the monarchy's relationship with its people and its government. Commander Fields, Sir Geoffrey said without preamble, I understand we have a problem. We have growing pains, sir. The regiment is adapting to necessary changes. Growing pains. Sir Geoffrey's tone was skeptical. I've received 17 formal complaints in the past month. Transfer requests are up 400%. And this morning's incident in the courtyard has been reported to me by 3 separate sources. Alexander realized that his actions were being monitored more closely than he had suspected. Sir, change is always difficult. But the Royal Guard cannot remain frozen in time while the world evolves around us. Sir Geoffrey walked to his window, looking out at the palace gardens where tourists gathered behind the iron railings. Commander, do you know what those people out there are looking for when they come to see the changing of the Guard? History, tradition, pageantry, consistency, Sir Geoffrey corrected. In a world that changes constantly, sometimes violently, they come here to see something that remains the same. The guards in their red tunics and bearskin hats represent stability, continuity, the enduring nature of our institutions. Alexander felt the conversation slipping away from him. But sir, if we don't adapt, we risk becoming irrelevant. Our ceremonial role is important, but we're also working soldiers with real security responsibilities. Are you questioning the wisdom of maintaining our traditions? I'm questioning whether traditions should prevent us from doing our jobs effectively. Sir. Geoffrey returned to his desk and opened a thick file. Your service record is impressive, Commander. Afghanistan, Iraq, counterterrorism operations. You've proven yourself in combat situations that most guards will never face. Thank you, sir. However, commanding the Royal Guard requires different skills than leading troops in combat. It requires understanding that some things are more important than efficiency or modernization. Alexander felt his career hanging in the balance. Things, sir. Faith, the faith that millions of people have in the permanence of our institutions. The faith that in a world full of uncertainty, there are still some things that don't change. Sir Geoffrey leaned forward. Your reforms are shaking that faith, Commander, not just among your own guards, but among the people who depend on us to represent something larger than ourselves. The meeting continued for another hour, with Alexander defending his position and Sir Geoffrey expressing the palace's growing concern about the division within the royal guard. By the time Alexander left, he understood that his job was in serious jeopardy, but he also understood something else. The conflict he had created wasn't just about training methods or female integration or modernized equipment. It was about competing visions of what the royal guard should represent in the 21st century. As Alexander drove back to the regimental headquarters, he faced a decision that would determine his legacy. He could retreat, abandoning his reforms to save his career and restore peace to the regiment. Or he could continue fighting for his vision, knowing that the cost might be everything he had worked to achieve. The chaos he had created was forcing everyone involved to examine their deepest beliefs about duty, tradition, and the meaning of service. And Commander Alexander Fields was about to discover whether his interpretation of heroic leadership could survive the storm he had unleashed. Alexander returned to the regimental headquarters to find chaos waiting for him. Word of his meeting with Sir Geoffrey had somehow spread through the ranks, and rumors were flying about his potential dismissal. Guards clustered in small groups throughout the building, conversations stopping abruptly when officers passed by. Captain Sarah Chen, one of the female officers who stood to benefit from Alexander's reforms, was waiting in his outer office. Her expression was grim as she stood to attention when he entered. "Sir, we need to talk," she said quietly. "Not now, Captain. I have reports to review, and, sir, with respect, this can't wait. The female guards are being harassed. Not officially. Not in any way that shows up in reports, but it's happening. Cold shoulders, excluded from informal gatherings, equipment that mysteriously malfunctions during their shifts." Alexander felt another weight settle on his shoulders. His reforms weren't just creating philosophical divisions, they were making life miserable for the very people he was trying to help. "Give me specifics," he said, leading her into his office. Captain Chen closed the door and spoke in low tones. "Corporal Williams found her dress uniform soaked with coffee yesterday morning, 30 minutes before an inspection. Guard Thompson was locked out of the armory for 2 hours during equipment maintenance. It's subtle, but it's systematic. Who's responsible? That's the problem, sir. It's not coming from any individual we can identify. It's a culture of resistance that's spreading through the ranks. The guards who support Lieutenant Colonel Webb aren't just disagreeing with your policies, they're actively sabotaging them." Alexander sank into his chair. The situation was spiraling beyond his control. What had started as a professional disagreement about modernization was becoming a campaign of intimidation against female soldiers. "What do you want me to do, Captain?" Chen's response surprised him. "I want you to consider whether your reforms are worth the price we're paying for them." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. Even his supporters were beginning to question whether the changes were worth the conflict they were creating. "You think I should abandon the reforms? I think you should ask yourself whether fighting this battle is serving the interests of the crown or just satisfying your own vision of what the royal guard should be." Before Alexander could respond, his phone rang. It was Colonel Webb, requesting an immediate meeting with the senior staff. Alexander agreed, knowing that whatever Webb was planning would likely determine the outcome of their growing conflict. The senior staff meeting took place in the main conference room, with maps and regimental standards lining the walls. Webb had assembled his supporters, mostly older officers who had served in the Royal Guard for decades. Alexander's allies were fewer in number, but no less determined. "Gentlemen," Webb began formally, "and ladies," he added with a nod toward Captain Chen and Sergeant Major Collins. "We are facing a crisis that threatens the very foundation of our regiment." Alexander bristled at Webb's presumption in calling the meeting, but he let the older officer continue. "Commander Fields' reforms have divided us into opposing camps. Guards are requesting transfers, morale is at an all-time low, and our effectiveness as a unit is compromised. Something must be done before permanent damage is inflicted on the Royal Guard." "What are you proposing, Colonel?" Alexander asked. Webb straightened, his bearing perfect, despite his obvious tension. I am proposing a formal review of all recent policy changes, with implementation suspended pending the outcome. Furthermore, I believe the senior staff should vote on whether to recommend your continued command to the Ministry of Defense.
Oh.
The room fell silent. Webb was essentially calling for a vote of no confidence in Alexander's leadership, a move that could destroy his career even if he technically survived it. Captain Morrison, one of Alexander's younger supporters, spoke up. Colonel Webb, with respect, that sounds suspiciously like mutiny. It sounds like senior officers exercising their responsibility to preserve regimental integrity. Webb replied coolly. Alexander realized that this was the moment he had been dreading and expecting. In equal measure, his command was being directly challenged by his subordinate in front of the entire senior staff. How he handled the next few minutes would determine not just his future, but the future of the Royal Guard itself. Colonel Webb, Alexander said. Carefully, are you questioning my authority as regimental commander? I am questioning the wisdom of policies that are tearing our regiment apart. That's not what I asked. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every officer present understood that they were witnessing a defining moment. Either Alexander would reassert his authority, or Webb's challenge would succeed in undermining his command. Alexander stood, using his full height to project command. Presence, let me be clear about something, Colonel. I am the commander of this regiment, appointed by the Crown and confirmed by the Ministry of Defense. My authority comes from sources higher than this room and higher than personal opinions. About policy, Webb didn't back down. Your authority comes from the trust and respect of the guards you command. When that trust is lost, authority becomes meaningless. You believe that trust has been lost? I believe it has been seriously damaged by reforms that prioritize political correctness over military effectiveness. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge to single combat. Alexander felt every eye in the room on him, waiting to see how he would respond to such a direct attack on his leadership and motivations. Let me ask you something, Colonel Webb. In your 28 years of service, how many times have you served alongside female soldiers in combat situations? Webb's jaw tightened. The Royal Guard's role is ceremonial, not combat. That's not what I asked. How many times? Never. I've served with female soldiers in Iraq, Afghanistan, and counterterrorism operations here in the UK. I've watched them perform with courage, skill, and dedication that would impress any professional soldier. So when I propose integrating qualified female guards into our ceremonial duties, it's not based on political correctness. It's based on personal experience with their capabilities. Alexander moved around the table, making eye contact with each officer. Every reform I've proposed is designed to make us better soldiers, more effective protectors, and more worthy representatives of the Crown. If that threatens some people's comfort with tradition, then perhaps they need to examine whether their dedication is to the institution or to their own resistance to change. The room remained silent for several long moments. Finally, Captain Chen spoke. Double quotes, sir. What exactly are you asking us to decide? Alexander realized that he had reached the point of no return. Whatever he said next would either restore his authority or destroy it completely. I'm asking you to trust that my reforms serve the best interests of the Royal Guard and the Crown. I'm asking you to believe that honoring our traditions doesn't require rejecting progress. I'm asking those who cannot support that vision to request transfer to units where they will be happier. It was essentially an ultimatum: support his leadership or leave. The audacity of it shocked even Alexander's supporters. Webb stood slowly, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been respect. Commander Fields, you have made your position clear. Now the regiment will have to live with the consequences of your choices. As the senior staff filed out of the conference room, Alexander realized that his gamble had either saved his command or sealed his fate. The chaos he had created was about to reach its climax, and everyone involved would soon discover whether Commander Fields was the heroic leader who transformed the Royal Guard, or the ambitious officer who destroyed it in pursuit of his own vision. The aftermath of Alexander's ultimatum played out over the following week with devastating efficiency. By Thursday morning, 12 senior guards had submitted transfer requests. including 3 squad leaders who had served in the Royal Guard for over 15 years. The exodus of experienced personnel threatened to cripple the regiment's operational capabilities. More troubling was the response from Webb and his supporters. Rather than openly defying Alexander's authority, they had begun what could only be described as passive resistance. Orders were followed to the letter, but without the initiative and enthusiasm that effective military service required. Training exercises proceeded mechanically. Ceremonial preparations lacked their usual precision, and the intangible esprit de corps that made the Royal Guard special was evaporating. Alexander found himself isolated in his command, supported by a handful of younger officers, but increasingly cut off from the rank-and-file guards who formed the backbone of the regiment. Even worse, reports were reaching him that his conflict with Webb was becoming the subject of gossip throughout the military establishment. His reputation was being damaged far beyond the boundaries of his own unit. The breaking point came during the weekly ceremonial inspection. Her Majesty's inspection of the Royal Guard was a tradition dating back centuries, an opportunity for the monarch to review the troops who served as her personal guard. It was also a highly visible event, attended by tourists, media, military observers from around the world. Alexander stood at attention as the inspection party approached, acutely aware that this ceremony could determine his future. The Queen moved along the ranks of guards with her usual grace and attention to detail, accompanied by her equerry and several senior military officials. The guards performed flawlessly, their drill movements precise and their bearing perfect. But Alexander could sense something wrong, a subtle tension in their posture, a mechanical quality to their responses that suggested they were going through the motions without the pride and enthusiasm he was accustomed to seeing. Her Majesty paused before Guard Thompson, one of the female soldiers Alexander had championed for ceremonial duty. The guard's uniform was impeccable, her posture perfect, but Alexander noticed something that made his blood run cold, a small but visible stain on her white gloves that hadn't been there during the pre-inspection briefing. The Queen noticed it too. Her expression didn't change, but Alexander caught the slight raising of her eyebrow that indicated royal displeasure. She moved on without comment, but the damage was done. In front of the most important audience possible, the Royal Guard had failed to maintain their legendary standards. After the inspection, Alexander confronted Guard Thompson in private. The young soldier's distress was obvious as she explained what had happened. "I don't know how it got there, sir," she said, staring at the stained gloves. "I checked them 30 minutes before the inspection. They were perfect." "What happened?" "In those 30 minutes, I was in the armory collecting my rifle. There were other guards there, but I didn't notice anyone. Sir, I think someone deliberately sabotaged my equipment." Alexander felt rage building in his chest. The passive resistance had escalated to active sabotage that had embarrassed the regiment in front of the Queen herself. This was no longer about policy, disagreements, or tradition. It was about the systematic harassment of soldiers under his command. He called an immediate meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Webb, not bothering with formalities or protocol. When Webb arrived at his office, Alexander's anger was barely contained. "Colonel, one of my guards was sabotaged during today's inspection. Someone deliberately stained her gloves between the pre-inspection check and the ceremony." Webb's expression remained neutral. "That's a serious accusation, Commander. It's a serious crime. Deliberately undermining a guard's performance during a royal inspection is tantamount to mutiny. Do you have evidence of who was responsible?" "I have evidence that your campaign of resistance has created an environment where this kind of sabotage is inevitable?" Webb bristled. "My campaign? Commander, I have followed every order you've given, supported every policy you've implemented, maintained discipline among the guards under my command. You've followed orders while making it clear that you disagree with them. You've supported policies while undermining confidence in their effectiveness. And you've maintained discipline while fostering an atmosphere of resentment and resistance." The two men faced each other across Alexander's desk, years of mutual respect crumbling under the weight of their ideological conflict. Webb leaned forward, his voice low but intense. "Alexander, I've served this regiment for 28 years. I've watched commanders come and go, seen policies change with political winds, witnessed reforms that were supposed to make us better, but only made us different. What I've learned is that the Royal Guard's strength comes from its traditions, its consistency, its refusal to bend to every passing fashion. And what I've learned, Alexander replied, is that institutions that refuse to adapt eventually become irrelevant. The Royal Guard can honor its traditions while still embracing the reality of the modern world. At what cost? Look around you, Alexander. Look at what your reforms have accomplished. Transfer requests, sabotage, guards questioning their loyalty to their own regiment. Is this the modernization you wanted? The question struck home because it echoed Alexander's own doubts. Had his pursuit of progress created more problems than it solved? Were his reforms worth the price the regiment was paying? Before he could answer, Sergeant Major Collins entered with an urgent message. Sir Geoffrey Morrison is on the phone. He wants to see you immediately regarding today's inspection. Alexander felt his stomach drop. The stained gloves had not gone unnoticed by the palace, and he was about to face the consequences. The conversation with Sir Geoffrey was brief and devastating. The Queen had indeed noticed the imperfection in Guard Thompson's uniform. Questions were being asked about the decline in standards within the Royal Guard. More importantly, Sir Geoffrey had received reports about the internal conflict within the regiment, including allegations of harassment and sabotage. Commander Field, Sir Geoffrey said with obvious disappointment. When we spoke last week, I expressed concerns about the division your reforms were creating. Today's incident suggests that those concerns were well-founded. Sir, I believe the incident was the result of deliberate sabotage by guards opposed to my policies. Whether it was sabotage or simply poor discipline, the result is the same. The Royal Guard failed to maintain its standards during a royal inspection. That is unacceptable under any circumstances. Alexander knew his career was hanging by a thread. Sir, what action are you considering? I am considering whether the Royal Guard requires new leadership to restore its effectiveness and unity. The conversation ended with Alexander being summoned to a formal review board the following Monday, where his continued command would be evaluated by senior military officials and representatives of the royal household. As Alexander sat in his office that evening, staring at the transfer requests and incident reports that documented the collapse of his authority, he realized that his vision of heroic leadership had led him to the brink of professional destruction. The chaos he had created in pursuit of modernization had given his enemies the ammunition they needed to destroy him, but even facing the end of his career, Alexander couldn't bring himself to regret fighting for what he believed was right. The question was whether history would remember him as a commander who had the courage to challenge outdated traditions, or as an officer whose arrogance had destroyed one of Britain's most prestigious military units. The answer would be determined by events that were already set in motion, as the Royal Guard prepared for a final confrontation that would decide not just Alexander's fate, but the future of the institution he had tried so hard to transform. The weekend before Alexander's review board felt like a death watch. The atmosphere in the regimental headquarters was thick with tension as guards went about their duties with mechanical precision, avoiding eye contact and speaking only when necessary. The divide between Alexander's supporters and Webb's traditionalists had hardened into open hostility, with each group viewing the upcoming review as a referendum on their vision of the Royal Guard's future. Alexander spent Saturday reviewing his service record, preparing his defense, and writing what might be his final report as commander. The statistics were sobering under his leadership. His transfer requests had increased by 400%, disciplinary incidents had doubled, and morale surveys showed the lowest satisfaction ratings in the regiment's recent history. But there were other statistics that told a different story. Training efficiency had improved by 15%. Physical fitness scores were at an all-time high, and the integration of new technology had enhanced their security capabilities significantly. The question was whether the review board would focus on the discord his reforms had created or the improvements they had achieved. Sunday brought an unexpected visitor to Alexander's quarters. Lieutenant Colonel Webb knocked on his door just after dawn, looking older and more tired than Alexander had ever seen him. Harrison, Alexander said, genuinely surprised. "What brings you here?" We need to talk, Alexander. Not as commander and subordinate, but as soldiers who have served together for 8 years. They sat in Alexander's small kitchen, drinking coffee, and speaking quietly, like conspirators planning a secret mission. The formality that had defined their relationship for months was temporarily set aside. "I've been thinking about what you said," Webb began. "About serving alongside female soldiers in combat. About adapting to modern realities." Alexander waited, sensing that Webb was struggling with something important. "I've never questioned the capability of female soldiers," Webb continued. "What I've questioned is whether changing the Royal Guard serves any meaningful purpose. We're not a combat unit anymore, Alexander. We're a symbol. And symbols, once altered, can never be restored to their original meaning. But symbols can evolve, Harrison. They can represent new ideals while honoring old values." Webb smiled sadly. "That's where we disagree. I believe some things should remain unchanged, not because they're perfect, but because they represent continuity in a world that changes too quickly." They talked for 2 hours, exploring the philosophical differences that had driven them apart. Alexander began to understand that Webb's resistance wasn't rooted in prejudice or stubborn traditionalism, but in a genuine belief that some institutions were worth preserving exactly as they were. "What's going to happen tomorrow?" Alexander asked, as Webb prepared to leave. "The board will ask me to assess your leadership. I'll tell them the truth, that you're a dedicated officer who believes passionately in your vision for the Royal Guard and that your vision is tearing the regiment apart." Alexander nodded, appreciating Webb's honesty even though it confirmed his worst fears. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable rain, turning the parade ground into a muddy reminder of the imperfection that lurked beneath the Royal Guard's polished surface. Alexander dressed in his best uniform, knowing that appearance mattered as much as substance in military reviews. The review board convened in a conference room at the Ministry of Defense, presided over by General Sir Marcus Thornton, a decorated veteran who commanded respect throughout the military establishment. Sir Geoffrey Morrison represented the royal household. Colonel James Whitfield spoke for the Army's personnel department. Alexander entered the room to find Webb already, seated at the witness table, looking formal and uncomfortable. Their eyes met briefly, and Alexander saw something he hadn't expected: sympathy, perhaps even regret.
"Commander Fields," General Thornton began.
"This board has been convened to review your leadership of the Royal Guard Regiment and to assess whether changes in command are necessary." The first hour focused on statistics and performance metrics. Alexander defended his record, highlighting improvements in training and operational readiness, while acknowledging the increase in transfer requests and disciplinary problems. "Commander," Sir Geoffrey interrupted, "your reforms may have improved certain measurable aspects of the regiment's performance, but they have clearly damaged its cohesion and morale. How do you justify changes that create such internal conflict?" Alexander had prepared for this question, but the answer still felt inadequate. "Sir, meaningful reform always creates temporary disruption. The question is whether short-term difficulties are justified by long-term improvements, and you believe they are?" "I believe the Royal Guard cannot fulfill its mission effectively if it refuses to adapt to contemporary realities." General Thornton leaned forward. "What mission is that, Commander? The Royal Guard's primary function is ceremonial." "With respect, sir, our mission extends beyond ceremony. We provide security for royal events, support counterterrorism operations, and serve as a visible symbol of military excellence. All of these responsibilities require us to be effective soldiers, not just impressive performers." Colonel Whitfield consulted his notes. "Commander, we've received reports of harassment directed at female guards under your command. How do you account for this breakdown in discipline?" Alexander felt the question like a physical blow. The harassment of his female soldiers was his greatest failure as a commander, a sign that his reforms had created an environment where intimidation flourished. "Sir, the harassment is unacceptable and represents the worst aspect of resistance to change. However, it also demonstrates why reform is necessary. If we cannot integrate qualified female soldiers into ceremonial roles without creating a hostile environment, then we are failing as a professional military unit." Or, Sir Geoffrey interjected, It demonstrates that some changes are too disruptive to implement without destroying the institution itself. The hearing continued for another 2 hours, with each board member probing different aspects of Alexander's leadership. Webb was called to testify, and Alexander watched his former mentor struggle with the conflict between personal loyalty and professional duty. Lieutenant Colonel Webb, General Thornton asked, "In your assessment, is Commander Fields an effective leader?" Webb was quiet for a long moment. "Sir, Commander Fields is one of the most dedicated officers I have ever served. His commitment to the Royal Guard is absolute, and his intentions are beyond question." "That's not what I asked, Colonel." Webb met Alexander's eyes across the room. "Sir, Commander Fields has implemented changes that, I believe, are fundamentally at odds with the Royal Guard's essential character. However, I also believe that his vision comes from a genuine desire to improve the regiment. Would you recommend his continued command?" Another long pause. "Sir, I would recommend that the board consider whether the Royal Guard's mission is best served by transformation or preservation." It was a diplomatic non-answer that avoided directly attacking Alexander while making clear where Webb's loyalties lay. The board recessed for deliberation, leaving Alexander alone in a small waiting room. Through the window, he could see the Thames flowing past government buildings where decisions were made that affected millions of lives. His own future seemed insignificant by comparison, yet it felt like the most important thing in the world. When the board reconvened, General Thornton's expression was unreadable. "Commander Fields, this board has reviewed your service record, assessed the current state of the Royal Guard Regiment, and considered testimony from your subordinates and superiors." Alexander stood at attention, prepared for the worst. "We find that your reforms have achieved measurable improvements in training and operational readiness. We also find that they have created significant internal conflict and damaged regimental cohesion." The general paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "However, we also find that the resistance to your leadership has sometimes crossed the line from legitimate disagreement to deliberate sabotage. The incident during last week's royal inspection was particularly concerning." Alexander felt a flicker of hope, quickly suppressed. "Therefore, this board makes the following recommendations. Commander Fields will retain command of the Royal Guard Regiment, but with specific conditions. All controversial reforms will be suspended for 6 months. While a comprehensive review is conducted by an independent panel, Lieutenant Colonel Webb will be transferred to a staff position at the Ministry of Defense, effective immediately." The decision hit Alexander like a physical shock. He had survived, but barely, and at the cost of losing Webb and abandoning the very reforms he had fought to implement. Furthermore, General Thornton continued, "Commander Fields will work with the independent review panel to develop a reform program that balances modernization with tradition. Any future changes must be approved by both the Ministry of Defense and the royal household before implementation." As the board adjourned, Alexander realized that he had achieved a Pyrrhic victory. He remained commander, but his authority had been severely curtailed, and his vision for the Royal Guard's future was in the hands of others. Webb approached him as they left the building, extending his hand with a mixture of respect and sadness. "I hope you can find a way forward that serves both progress and tradition," Webb said quietly. "I hope I can find a way to heal the damage I've caused," Alexander replied. The rain had stopped, and London's afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds as Alexander returned to regimental headquarters. The chaos he had created was far from over, but perhaps it was beginning to transform into something more constructive than mere conflict. The final test of his leadership was about to begin, not the heroic charge toward reform he had envisioned, but the harder challenge of building consensus, healing divisions, and proving that change and tradition could coexist within the same proud institution. 6 months later, Alexander stood in the same courtyard where his reforms had first sparked open rebellion. Watching a scene that would have seemed impossible during the darkest days of the conflict, female guards trained alongside their male counterparts, not in the controversial ceremonial roles he had originally proposed, but in enhanced security protocols that had emerged from the independent review panel's recommendations. The transformation hadn't come easily. The weeks following Webb's transfer had been marked by continued tension, suspicious glances, and the kind of careful politeness that indicated deep wounds were still healing. Alexander had been forced to rebuild his leadership from the ground up, his time focusing on consensus rather than confrontation. The independent review panel, led by retired General Dame Sarah Richardson, spent 4 months examining every aspect of the Royal Guard's operations. Their final report had surprised everyone involved by recommending a middle path that neither traditionalists nor reformers had anticipated, rather than integrating female guards into the highly visible ceremonial duties that had sparked the original conflict. The panel recommended expanding their roles in security, intelligence gathering, and specialized protection details. Female guards would serve alongside their male colleagues in functions that utilized their skills without challenging the ceremonial traditions that Webb and his supporters considered sacred. The compromise had satisfied no one completely, but it had given everyone enough of what they wanted to move forward. Alexander's supporters saw it as progress toward full integration, while traditionalists viewed it as a reasonable expansion that preserved the Royal Guard's essential character. More importantly, review had identified and addressed the harassment that had plagued female soldiers under Alexander's command. New policies, mandatory training, and clear consequences for discriminatory behavior had created an environment where professional respect could gradually replace the hostility that had nearly destroyed the regiment's unity. Captain Sarah Chen approached Alexander as he watched the morning training, her expression reflecting the cautious optimism that had begun to replace the tension of earlier months. "Sir, the new security protocols are working well. Guard Thompson's intelligence analysis helped prevent a potential incident during last week's state visit." Alexander smiled, remembering the young guard whose sabotaged gloves had become a symbol of the regiment's dysfunction. Thompson had emerged as one of the most capable intelligence analysts in the unit, proving her worth in ways that transcended ceremonial duties. "Any word from Colonel Webb?" Chen asked quietly. Alexander nodded. Webb's transfer to the Ministry of Defense had initially felt like exile, but it had evolved into an opportunity for both men to gain perspective on their conflict. Webb's new position involved developing training standards for ceremonial units throughout the military, work that utilized his expertise while removing him from the day-to-day tensions of reform implementation. "He's coming to visit next week," Alexander said. "The ministry wants him to assess our progress for the final review." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Webb, the symbol of resistance to Alexander's reforms, would now judge whether the compromise solutions were working effectively. The morning's training concluded without incident, a small miracle that Alexander had learned not to take for granted. As the guards returned to their duties, Sergeant Major Collins approached with the day's briefing materials. "Sir, we've received the quarterly morale survey results," she said, handing him a thick folder. Alexander opened it with the same anxiety he had felt awaiting the review board's decision. The numbers told a story of gradual improvement, transfer requests down 60% from their peak, disciplinary incidents at normal levels, and satisfaction ratings climbing steadily toward acceptable ranges. But the most telling statistic was buried in the detailed analysis. 78% of guards now believed that the Royal Guard could honor its traditions while adapting to modern requirements. 6 months earlier, that number had been less than 30%. "Collins," Alexander said, "arrange a meeting with the senior staff. It's time to discuss the next phase of implementation." The senior staff meeting took place in the same conference room where Webb had challenged Alexander's authority. But the atmosphere was dramatically different. The officers who gathered around the table were still divided in their approaches to reform, but they shared a common commitment to the regiment's success. Captain Morrison, one of Alexander's early supporters, presented the security enhancement proposals that had emerged from collaboration between traditional guards and reform advocates. The plan integrated new technology and procedures while maintaining the ceremonial protocols that defined the Royal Guard's public image. "The beauty of this approach," Morrison explained, "is that it makes us more effective without making us different in ways that matter to the public." Major Elizabeth Hawthorne, who had initially opposed Alexander's reforms, nodded approvingly. The tourists still see the same red uniforms and bearskin hats. They still get the pageantry they come for, but we're better prepared to handle real security threats. Alexander listened to the discussion with satisfaction tempered by hard-won wisdom. The compromise wasn't the bold transformation he had originally envisioned, but it was sustainable change that served the regiment's needs without tearing it apart. The meeting was interrupted by an urgent message from the palace. Sir Geoffrey Morrison requested Alexander's immediate presence for a matter of significant importance. Given their history, Alexander felt his stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. But when he arrived at Buckingham Palace, Sir Geoffrey's demeanor was markedly different from their previous encounters. The private secretary actually smiled as he gestured for Alexander to sit. "Commander Fields, I wanted to discuss the Royal Guard's performance during this week's NATO summit. The security arrangements were flawless, the ceremonial elements were executed with traditional precision, and I received several compliments from foreign delegates about the professionalism of your guards." Alexander felt relief flooding through him. "Thank you, sir." More importantly, Her Majesty specifically noticed the improved atmosphere within the regiment. She commented that the guards seemed more confident, more unified than they had appeared in recent months. Sir Geoffrey walked to his window, looking out at the palace grounds where tourists gathered daily to witness the changing of the guard. "You know, Commander, when we first discussed your reforms, I was concerned that change would undermine the stability that the Royal Guard represents. I understand those concerns, sir. What I've learned is that institutions can evolve without losing their essential character, provided the evolution is managed thoughtfully rather than imposed dramatically." The private secretary returned to his desk and picked up an official-looking document. "Her Majesty has asked me to present you with a commendation for exceptional leadership during a period of significant challenge. She particularly wanted to recognize your ability to find solutions that served both progress and tradition." Alexander accepted the commendation with genuine surprise. 6 months earlier, he had expected his career to end in disgrace. Now he was being honored for successfully navigating the very crisis his reforms had created. Sir Geoffrey Alexander said carefully, "May I ask what changed Her Majesty's perspective?" "Results, Commander. The Royal Guard is more effective than it was a year ago, but it's also more unified. It's a rare combination in any organization undergoing change." As Alexander returned to regimental headquarters that evening, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. His original vision of rapid, comprehensive reform had nearly destroyed the very institution he was trying to improve. But the compromise solution that emerged from conflict and controversy had achieved something more valuable, sustainable change that enhanced the Royal Guard's capabilities while preserving its identity. The chaos he had created had forced everyone involved to examine their assumptions about duty, tradition, and the meaning of service. In the end, both reformers and traditionalists had discovered that their core values were more compatible than their methods had suggested. Webb arrived for his assessment visit the following week, and the reunion between the two officers was marked by mutual respect rather than the tension that had once defined their relationship. As they toured the facilities together, observing the integrated training programs and enhanced security protocols, Webb offered his own evaluation of the transformation. "You were right about the need for change, Alexander," he said quietly. "I was right about the importance of preserving our essential character. The solution we found serves both purposes." "Do you think it will last?" Alexander asked. Webb considered the question carefully. "Change that comes from consensus is more durable than change that comes from conflict. What you've built here has the support of people who were once your strongest opponents. That's the foundation of lasting reform." As they stood watching the evening ceremony, with guards performing their ancient ritual enhanced by modern security awareness, Alexander realized that his legacy would not be defined by the chaos his initial reforms had created, but by his ability to transform that chaos into constructive change. The Royal Guard had emerged from its greatest internal crisis stronger and more unified than before. The question of whether Commander Fields was a heroic leader or the architect of chaos had been answered not by his intentions, but by his results, and by his willingness to learn from failure, adapt his approach, and find solutions that served both progress and tradition. In the end, perhaps that was what heroic leadership truly meant. Not the courage to impose one's vision, but the wisdom to help others discover a vision they could share.